Hey guys, it's Mike here, and over the course of my time on YouTube, I have broken down and analyzed some of the greatest and biggest what-if scenarios in the history of the Dragon Ball franchise. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down and doing a deep dive, in-depth discussion and analysis of all of the biggest versus battles of the Buu Saga, the final arc of the original manga. But before I begin, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. That way you can stay up to date with all of my future videos. Make sure to leave a like, share your own thoughts down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and let's get directly into the video.
Hey guys, Mike here, and today I'm bringing you another segment on Dragon Ball Z. The topic of this video is one that I believe many people have been wondering about for a long time. And that is, what if the Z Fighters destroyed Babidi's spaceship before Buu was revived? The story here is basically that once the Z Fighters were inside of Babidi's spaceship during the Buu Saga, and fighting the different opponents on the different stages, Vegeta proposed blowing up the entire spaceship just to get to the bottom, as opposed to fighting all of the different opponents on each stage. Naturally, this was shut down by the Supreme Kai, who said blowing up the spaceship would risk awakening Majin Buu. But what if Vegeta and the other Z Fighters decided to ignore Supreme Kai's warnings and did it anyway? How would blowing up Babidi's spaceship and awakening Buu prematurely affect the story? And would this new course of action result in positive or negative consequences for the Z Fighters and the rest of the Earth? Well, let's take a more detailed look at this and find out. First, there's a number of different factors that have to be considered to find out what exactly would happen next after the Z Fighters destroy Babidi's spaceship. First, we have to consider the words of the Supreme Kai, and to be honest, most of what he has to say is very unreliable. The primary reason that the Z Fighters didn't simply destroy Babidi's spaceship is because of what the Supreme Kai said, namely that it could lead to the premature release of Majin Buu, which in turn could lead to all of their deaths and the destruction of the Earth. However, the Supreme Kai's objections can be called into question because of the fact that 1. He doesn't know how powerful the Z Fighters actually are. 2. He has no idea how much energy Babidi has actually gathered from Majin Buu. And 3. He's constantly overestimating the powers of Babidi's men and underestimating the powers of the Z Fighters in comparison to them. From the moment the Supreme Kai meets the Z Fighters, he's constantly underestimating their powers and assuming that he's more powerful than they are. This carries over into when the Z Fighters fight Babidi's henchmen, as the Supreme Kai assumes that they'll lose unless they team up together to fight them. And in nearly every example where the Supreme Kai is concerned, he's immediately proven wrong by the Z Fighters. If anything, every action made by the Supreme Kai actually hurts their efforts to stop Majin Buu, so it's safe to assume we could simply discard all of his concerns about this course of action. The next factor would definitely have to be Vegeta. As we know, Vegeta got an idea of how powerful Babidi's magic was after he saw Spopovich and Yamu at the tournament. After observing the fight between Goku and Yakan, Vegeta saw Goku's power firsthand. It was at this point that Vegeta decided to fall under Babidi's spell so that he could use the increase in power to close the gap between himself and Goku. However, if they were to destroy Babidi's spaceship, this fight would likely never take place. As a result, it'd be very unlikely that Vegeta would see Goku's power firsthand until he's fighting Majin Buu himself. Thus, there would be no real time for Vegeta to fall under Babidi's spell and for him to turn against the rest of the Z Fighters. This would give us a more focused, albeit slightly weaker Vegeta who would be helping the rest of the Z Fighters fight against Majin Buu. And now, of course, this brings us to the final and biggest factor of them all, Majin Buu himself, or namely his power at this point after they blew up the spaceship. And I believe that the series actually gives us a definite answer here. If we recall, all of the energy that was stolen from Gohan at the tournament was deposited directly into Majin Buu's shell, and went directly to him. Babidi was then shocked to find that Buu's power meter was reading at nearly halfway full. He then remarked that it's very possible that it came from a single shot, which we know was Gohan's power. This should immediately tell us that there's only one source that all of this power came from, and that would be Gohan himself, which would mean that Buu and Gohan would be equal in power. And this instantly makes this a much better scenario than it was in the original timeline. The reason for this is because both Goku and Vegeta are more powerful than Gohan was, and even more powerful than he was when he fought against Cell. This would mean that either one of them in their Super Saiyan 2 forms would be more than a match for Buu and would be able to destroy him. And with Gohan still there, who would be equal in power to Buu at this point, the three of them could easily team up and destroy him without Goku ever needing to go Super Saiyan 3. The only difference in this situation is that it's likely that Babidi and his henchmen are all still alive after the explosion of the ship. So the Z-Fighters would have to fight all of them at once, as opposed to one of them at a time. And this would include Deborah, who at this point would likely be more powerful than Buu is. But considering the combined strength of the three Super Saiyans and the Supreme Kai, this shouldn't be too big of a problem, as Gohan and the Supreme Kai can deal with the henchmen while Goku and Vegeta deal with the rest. And if for any reason it becomes too much, Goku can easily turn into a Super Saiyan 3 and destroy them all with ease. So there you have it. I believe I've demonstrated exactly what would happen if the Z-Fighters decide to ignore Supreme Kai's words and destroy Babidi's spaceship anyway, releasing Majin Buu prematurely. In the end, I believe that he would end up being a far weaker adversary than he ended up being in the original timeline, and the saga wouldn't last anywhere near as long as it did. As a result, the Z-Fighters would never end up being killed, the Earth would never end up being destroyed, Goku would never need to come back to life, and Buu would be killed in quick fashion. In the end, it's only due to the Supreme Kai's incompetence that any of this ever happened in the first place, and if he had simply stepped aside and allowed the Z-Fighters to do what they wanted to, everything would have worked out alright in the end. Well, my name is Mike, and this has been another segment on Dragon Ball Z. Let me know your own thoughts in the comments section and what topics you'd like me to talk about in the future. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as I always say, stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. Hey guys, it's Mike here, and welcome to another segment on Dragon Ball Z. The topic of this video is one that I believe would have very interesting ramifications for Dragon Ball Z and the entire timeline. That topic is, what if the Supreme Kai came to Earth before the Buu Saga? Now, as we all know, the Supreme Kai came to the Earth during the Buu Saga in an effort to recruit the Z-Fighters in order to prevent the resurrection and release of Majin Buu. This plan failed in the end, however, due to a combination of the Supreme Kai not doing enough research on the Earth, underestimating the powers of the Z-Fighters, and not being forward-thinking enough. As a result, Buu was released, leading to the extinction of the entire human race and the destruction of the Earth. But what if the Supreme Kai actually was more forward-thinking and decided to come to the Earth earlier than he had? What difference could this actually make in the overall story and timeline? Well, let's take a more detailed look at this and find out. Now, considering that the Supreme Kai actually knew that Buu's shell was on Earth since it was deposited there, considering how he actually tracked Babidi to the Earth and killed him after this happened, this would give the Supreme Kai a range of thousands or perhaps even millions of years in which he could have returned to the Earth before the Buu Saga. But for the sake of this argument, we'll just say that the Supreme Kai came to the Earth sometime during the events of Dragon Ball Z. So what exactly would happen depending upon when the Supreme Kai came to the Earth? Well, let's break it down by the saga. So let's start first with the Saiyan saga. So for this first scenario, let's first assume that the Supreme Kai didn't interfere with the fight with Raditz, as those events took place over such a short period of time. As a result, Goku probably still would have died and gone to train with King Kai. If the Supreme Kai had been watching during this period of time, it's likely this event that would have tipped him off, as immortal training with one of the Kais is a very rare event. In fact, the only one to ever traverse Snake Way and train with King Kai before Goku was King Yama, and that was perhaps hundreds or even thousands of years before. At this point, it's likely that the Supreme Kai would allow everything to play out the way that it normally would have happened. Goku would train with King Kai, Gohan and Piccolo would train together, and the Z-Fighters would train with Kami. At this point, the Saiyans would arrive and fight the Z-Fighters. Everything that would happen after this point is pretty up in the air, considering exactly what happened in the original story. It is entirely possible that the Supreme Kai might step in once it's apparent that Goku will not make it in time to fight the Saiyans, and especially after some of the Z-Fighters start to get killed. And if the Supreme Kai actually did the proper research and found out about the Dragon Balls and knew that Piccolo is connected to Kami, the god of the Earth, it's likely that he wouldn't allow him to be killed either, as in this case the Dragon Balls would become useless and he wouldn't be able to resurrect the rest of the Z-Fighters whom he would need to help combat Babidi in the future. Although considering that Gogeta can also teleport, it's very possible that he would actually go and meet Goku in the other world and teleport him directly to the battlefield. This way the Supreme Kai wouldn't have to directly interfere in Earth's affairs or insert himself into the battle. Although it's also entirely possible that he would allow everything to play out exactly the way it did to test Goku and the rest of the Z Fighters to see if they're worthy enough to fight alongside him. Although it's also entirely possible that the Supreme Kai might intervene once he sees that Goku is at a severe disadvantage against Vegeta in his Great Ape form, or perhaps even after this, once Goku is down on the battlefield and no one seems to be able to stop Vegeta. In either case, if the Supreme Kai were to intervene, considering just how strong he is, the entire fight would be over in an instant. Depending upon the Supreme Kai's course of action, there's 3 different things that could happen in this scenario. If the Supreme Kai intervened early enough in the fight, it's likely that the Z Fighters would all survive and the Saiyans would be killed. This would mean that there would be no reason at all for the Z Fighters to go to Namek to try and get their Dragon Balls, and it's unlikely that they would ever have to fight Frieza. However, if the Supreme Kai intervened either late in the fight or not at all, it's very likely that things would happen almost exactly the same as they did in the original timeline, aside from the fact that Vegeta might not be around. Considering the deaths of his friends, it's very likely that Goku would be very insistent on going to Namek and trying to use their Dragon Balls to wish his friends back. However, if the Supreme Kai intervened at the end of the fight between Goku and Vegeta and killed Vegeta, it's likely that Goku and his friends would all be at a great disadvantage considering that Vegeta helped so much during their fight on Namek. Also, if Gogeta were to heal Goku and he were able to go with his friends to Namek right away, this would also put him at an even greater disadvantage, considering the fact that he wouldn't be able to use the Capsule Corp spaceship or its 100 times gravity to increase his powers to the levels that he originally arrived on Namek in. So even if Goku were to be able to get past Sarban and Dodoria using the Kaioken, if Frieza were to call in the Ginyu Force as he originally had, it's likely that Goku would not be strong enough to stand a chance against them, and especially not against Captain Ginyu himself. And in this case, even if Goku and his friends did get past Ginyu and the Ginyu Force, it's still likely that Frieza in his first form would be able to kill all of them with ease. So the only scenario where I can see this actually working would be if the Supreme Kai intervened early and ensured that none of the Z Fighters died. At this point, considering how the Supreme Kai knows just how powerful Buu was, and how powerful Babidi and his henchmen will likely be, and considering just how powerful the Supreme Kai is himself, it's very likely that the Supreme Kai will set about training the Z Fighters himself to prepare them for the eventual coming of Babidi. And considering the power difference between the Supreme Kai and the rest of the Z Fighters, and considering just how fast both Saiyans and Mechians make massive gains in strength, this would likely result in the Z Fighters becoming vastly more powerful than they would have been at the end of the series. So by the time the androids rolled around, it's possible that even the humans would be able to take care of them. And yes, that even includes Yamcha. And by the time Babidi and his henchmen finally arrive, it would be all too easy for the Z Fighters to defeat them. And even Buu if he somehow were to be released. But what if the Supreme Kai came a little bit later down the timeline, say in the Frieza saga? What would happen then? Well, this is actually a more likely scenario considering who Frieza was and what his place was in the universe. Up until his defeat at the hands of Goku, Frieza was an intergalactic tyrant and the biggest threat in the universe. Almost no other mortal even came close in power to Frieza, and not only did the Supreme Kai know of him, but King Kai, and it's very likely that the other gods did too. Frieza was responsible for the genocide and enslavement of a number of alien races, and the destruction of a multitude of worlds. And as the highest ranking god as well as the god of creation, the Supreme Kai was directly at odds with Frieza and his goals for the universe. Now with Frieza seeking to use the Dragon Balls to grant himself immortality, which would potentially extend his rule eternally, this would make sense as the perfect place for Supreme Kai to step in and put a stop to it once and for all. However, with the Z Fighters around, this makes the whole situation a lot more complicated. In this scenario, there's 2 different points that I could see the Supreme Kai inserting himself into the conflict on Namek. The first point would be after Captain Ginyu has brought all of the remaining Dragon Balls to Frieza. Just as Frieza didn't know that there was a password needed to summon the dragon on Namek, the Supreme Kai likely wouldn't know this either, and seeing that Frieza has gathered all 7 of the Dragon Balls would likely step in to prevent him from gaining immortality. Now considering how Supreme Kai in the series said he was powerful enough to destroy Frieza with a single blast, it's likely that he would be able to effortlessly defeat both Frieza and Captain Ginyu, especially considering that Frieza is in his most constrained form. The only other point that I could see this taking place would have to be during the fight against Frieza himself. And this would either have to take place during the initial fight with Vegeta, Gohan, Krillin, and Piccolo, or during Frieza's fight with Goku. At both points where the Supreme Kai could interfere in this fight, it's likely that it would result in the same end result. If the Supreme Kai interferes earlier, then Vegeta will likely survive. None of Goku's friends will die, so he won't need to turn Super Saiyan. Frieza will be effortlessly killed by the Supreme Kai, and Namek won't be destroyed. Then with Piccolo still alive, they'll be able to resurrect all of the Namekians that Frieza did kill. And then with the Namekian Dragon Balls, bring back all the people who died during the fight against the Saiyans. If the Supreme Kai were to intervene later during the fight between Goku and Frieza, it's likely that he would intervene before Goku gets the chance to turn into a Super Saiyan. Once again, in this case, the Supreme Kai would kill Frieza, and everyone else who has died would be resurrected with the Dragon Balls. In this case, the same outcome would probably happen that happened in the Saiyan Saga, with the Supreme Kai taking the Z-Fighters under his wing and training all of them to combat Buu in the future. And once again, by the time the androids come around, the Z-Fighters should be more than powerful enough to defeat them. This brings us to our last scenario in which the Supreme Kai could have inserted himself into the Dragon Ball Z timeline before the Buu Saga. The Android and Cell Saga makes perfect sense as a period of time in which the Supreme Kai would want to insert himself into the picture, considering the events that preceded it. With the defeat of the space tyrant Frieza at Goku's hands, and the death of Frieza and his father at Trunks' hands, the Super Saiyan has replaced Frieza in the order of the strongest beings in the mortal universe. So it only makes sense now for the Supreme Kai to show up and train the Z-Fighters to overcome their upcoming obstacles as well as Buu in the future. In this case, I see 3 different points in which the Supreme Kai can insert himself into the picture. The first would have to be the 3 years of training before the emergence of the androids. With the knowledge of the future brought to them by Trunks about the death of Goku and the overrunning of the Earth by the androids, it's likely that the Supreme Kai would want to intervene at this point in the story and train the Z-Fighters so that they can combat and destroy the androids when they arrive. And with 3 years training under the Supreme Kai, it's a certainty that the Z-Fighters would be able to destroy the androids. And this would also leave Cell without any androids to absorb, which would make him easy pickings for the Z-Fighters, just as it did Trunks in the future. The next point in time would have to be during the period of time in which the Z-Fighters are reeling from their loss at the hands of the androids, and during the period of time in which Goku is dealing with the heart virus. This would have a similar end result with the Supreme Kai killing the androids and maybe Cell as well. In either case, Cell wouldn't have the androids to absorb, so he would be much easier to defeat. The only other point that I could see the Supreme Kai intervening would have to be during the Cell game. And this would definitely have to be the most difficult and challenging of all the other scenarios. The reason I say this is that Perfect Cell is far more powerful than all of the other villains that Supreme Kai would have to fight before this. So this whole scenario comes down to how powerful Supreme Kai actually was, and there seems to be a lot of debate about this. Now of course the Supreme Kai said that he and the other Supreme Kais were powerful enough to take out Frieza with a single blast, so he's certainly above Frieza's level. But I would go one step further to say that he's either on or above Perfect Cell's level as well. Now a lot of this revolves around his fight with Piccolo. After sensing the Supreme Kai's power and figuring out who he was, Piccolo decided to throw the fight and give up. Now some say that this is Piccolo having respect for the Supreme Kai as a deity, as well as assuming that because of his standing in the universe he's the more powerful opponent. And of course because Piccolo was once Piccolo and Kami, he would definitely know full well just how powerful the other higher deities would be. However, there's also another side of the argument that states that Piccolo was actually weaker than the Supreme Kai, and a lot of this is backed up by the fact that Piccolo said this to Goku after he forfeited the match. In my case, I actually fall in the middle and think that it was actually both of these factors. In Piccolo's case, even if his opponent was more powerful than himself, it's likely that he wouldn't simply give up and not fight him. So it's a certainty that the Supreme Kai being involved is the main reason that he gave up the fight. However, in the original manga, the words that Piccolo said to Goku, that their dimensions were too different, has only ever been used in Dragon Ball to say that someone is far more powerful than their opponent. A perfect example of this would be what Tien said after he witnessed Goku power up into Super Saiyan firsthand against the androids. Not only this, but supplemental material such as the Daisenshu actually says that Supreme Kai is more powerful than Piccolo. So as far as I'm concerned, all of the evidence points to Supreme Kai actually being stronger than Piccolo. So of course this raises the question of how powerful Piccolo actually was. Some people like to say that Piccolo is on par with Semi-Perfect Cell, however I would have to say that that's really impossible. The reason for this is both Vegeta and Trunks, after coming out of the hyperbolic time chamber, were able to effortlessly defeat Semi-Perfect Cell and kill him if they so desired. Now, as we know, before Piccolo went into the time chamber himself, he was way above the other Super Saiyans. Whereas they were all being defeated with ease by Android 18, Piccolo was able to fight 17 to a stalemate and arguably was more powerful than he was. Furthermore, Trunks' reaction after Piccolo exited the time chamber certainly implies that he grew more powerful than Trunks and Vegeta were before their second time in the chamber. And obviously this would mean that he would be vastly above semi-perfect Cell at that stage. Furthermore, when it came to fighting the Cell Juniors, only Piccolo, Vegeta, and Trunks were the ones who were able to actually fight back or stand a chance against them. So this would make sense that Piccolo would be on par with Trunks and Vegeta after their second time in the time chamber. Now, the Buu Saga takes place 7 years later, and as we know, Piccolo is always training, and as he even said to Gohan, this is how he likes to spend all of his time, otherwise he'd become way too bored. So as a result of this, after 7 years of training, and considering the big gains that Piccolo has made in the past, I would have to put Piccolo around Perfect Cell's level at this point in time. And as a result of this, by default, the Supreme Kai would have to be more powerful than Perfect Cell. And this actually makes sense considering how long Supreme Kai lasted against Majin Buu. In fact, Supreme Kai actually took more blows and lasted even longer against Buu than Gohan did. And considering that Supreme Kai was able to restrain Gohan in his Super Saiyan 2 form, it doesn't make any sense for him to be weaker than Perfect Cell. So if Supreme Kai were to enter the Cell games and fight Cell instead of the other Z fighters, I'm pretty certain that he would win. As a result of this, Goku would never have to die and would be around to help train Gohan so he wouldn't get weak in the time of peace. And just as in the other scenarios, the Supreme Kai would help to train the Z fighters and give them another common goal to fight towards, just as Trunks did with the androids. As a result, they would be far more powerful than they were in the original timeline when Babidi arrived, and they would be able to defeat him and his henchmen with ease. So there you have it. I believe I've demonstrated exactly what would happen if Supreme Kai came earlier in the series. If he had simply been more forward-thinking and actually did his proper research, he would have been able to make a huge positive impact, which would have changed everything that happened in the Buu Saga. But unfortunately, none of this ever actually happened. Well, my name is Mike, and this has been another segment on Dragon Ball Z. Tell me your own thoughts in the comments section, what you thought of this video, and what topics you would like me to talk about in the future. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as I always say, stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
What if Majin Buu was revived in the future Trunks timeline? Would Trunks have been able to defeat him? In this video, I'm going to discuss that. So in the future Trunks arc of Dragon Ball Super, we learn that Trunks had encountered Babidi and Deborah in his timeline. This event transpired years after it did in the main timeline, once Trunks in his future had begun to rebuild society, after the devastation brought on by Dr. Gero and the androids. Just like in the main timeline, Babidi had come to the Earth to collect energy in order to revive Majin Buu. He planned to do so using the same device as Spopovich and Yamu during the World's Martial Arts Tournament. However, in this event, it didn't appear that Babidi enlisted the help of human henchmen, or attacked the tournament. The likely reason being that the androids killed off everyone on Earth who would be considered a viable minion for Babidi. So that means that Spopovich and Yamu likely faced a terrible fate here as well. As a result, it's likely that they intended to steal energy from the populace of the planet in order to fuel Buu's resurrection. However, before this could happen, the Supreme Kai appeared before Trunks and recruited him to stop this threat. In the manga version of the story, Trunks trained under the Supreme Kai with the Z Sword, just like Gohan did in the main timeline. He even gained magical healing powers, because of course Goku needed to be healed and have a one-on-one fight with a fusion. But anyway, even despite that, the two of them were unable to defeat Deborah and Babidi. That was until Trunks became a Super Saiyan 2, at which point he overpowered Deborah and wiped him out with a Ki Blast, along with Babidi, putting an end to their terrible plans once and for all, and sparing the Earth from total destruction. At least until Zamasu showed up and ruined everything. Good job. But what if events transpired differently? What if Babidi was able to follow through on his plans without the intervention of Trunks and creepy Shin? Just look at that smile. Well, first, we have to discuss if this would actually be possible for Babidi to accomplish, by addressing the main fuel for Buu's revival, with that being the energy of the human population. Now, despite many fan theories over the years, it doesn't seem that Babidi returned to the Earth in Dragon Ball Z because he sensed Gohan vs. Cell, or any massive power in particular. After all, he has faster-than-light spaceships and instant teleportation, so he likely would have just shown up right after that happened. And I discussed this in another video you can check out here. Instead, Babidi seemed woefully unaware of just how powerful the Z fighters on Earth were, which was demonstrated by the fights that took place on his ship, as Vegeta effortlessly killed Pui Pui and Goku killed Yakan. And then there's the Killy ratings for Goku, which is a whole other can of worms I'm not going to get into right now. Nonetheless, it doesn't seem that it was Babidi's original plan to steal the energy from just a few fighters. And for all we know, going to the World's Martial Arts Tournament was actually Spopovich and Yamu's idea, considering that at least Spopovich was a prior contestant. Instead, he likely planned to drain a large segment of the population. This is where it becomes problematic, because in Trunks' timeline, most of the population was wiped out years prior, so they were in a state of rebuilding and repopulation. Additionally, the Earth in Dragon Ball wasn't exactly as populated as our own, since a few hundred years before Dragon Ball begins, most of the human population was wiped out by King Piccolo, so it's not exactly a huge sample size. Despite that, I believe that Babidi would have been able to still accomplish this. That's because of what he says after injecting Gohan's energy into Buu's shell. Now, there was a meter attached to this shell that told Babidi how much power Buu needed in order to be revived. It was kind of like a gas tank. Fill her up and you're good to go. However, Babidi was shocked to find out that from a single person, Buu's meter was nearly halfway full. What Babidi says next is, "Did they tap hundreds of people? I wouldn't have killed them if I'd known they could get so much so quickly." And that line tells us two things. The first being that Babidi didn't know how powerful Gohan or the others were on Earth, which is backed up by Deborah's statement, "They weren't like this when I checked 300 years ago." Which again was roughly around the time of when King Piccolo attacked, so that makes sense. But the other key bit of information is that Babidi would only need hundreds to low thousands of people to drain in order to revive Buu. Otherwise, he wouldn't have used the word hundreds, but rather thousands, millions, or not even put the qualifier in there to begin with. Now, this does seem odd because it required the power of Super Saiyan 2 Gohan and the fight between Super Saiyan 2 Goku and Majin Vegeta to resurrect Buu. And just one of them individually is more powerful than everyone added up on Earth if we go by power levels. So I'm guessing that the energy that they use has more to it than fighting power, and could perhaps also absorb other aspects of Ki, such as pure life energy. Much like how Cell was absorbing people's bio-extract, rather than simply their fighting power. The Spirit Bomb that killed Kid Buu is another great example, because when Goku took the maximum amount of Genki from the people of Earth, and some other locations around the universe, it far exceeded the amount that the Z fighters put in alone, even powerful fighters such as Ultimate Gohan. So even if the Earth in Trunks' timeline only had hundreds of thousands of people at this point, I think resurrecting Buu would be within the realm of possibility. Even then, they still had the chance to get some energy during the fight between Deborah and Trunks. So for the purposes of this video, let's say that Babidi survived the blast from Super Saiyan 2 Trunks, putting up a barrier and teleporting himself to the center of a populated city. After using his magical powers and absorbing the people's energy, he's able to revive Fat Buu. Now, with that being done, what happens next? Could future Trunks actually defeat Buu? Well, that comes down to how powerful Trunks was at the time. Fortunately, we have some strong evidence to tell us just that, because as I mentioned earlier, Trunks fought Deborah when he and Babidi arrived on Earth. During their battle, Trunks was at a disadvantage. Despite all of his training with the Z-Sword, he could only become a Super Saiyan, and so the power difference made him unable to win. However, after becoming a Super Saiyan 2, Trunks easily overpowered Deborah and killed him. So going by this, I'd say that Trunks was probably around the power of Super Saiyan 2 Goku and Majin Vegeta during the Buu Saga of Dragon Ball Z. This would put Trunks above Super Perfect Cell and Super Saiyan 2 Gohan from that time period. An impressive amount of power, but a level that would present problems if he came face to face with Buu. That's because of what we saw during the fight between Fat Buu and Majin Vegeta. Despite Vegeta going all out, he stood no chance against Buu. Even Vegeta's sacrifice, where he released a final explosion and reduced Buu to shreds, wasn't enough to kill him. So as a result, Trunks would stand no chance as well, like father like son. Although if he did encounter Buu, it would probably still make for a fun fight, with Trunks chopping him up with his sword, only for Buu to split into smaller versions of himself, or instantly reform. I'd love to see someone animate this. Trunks would no doubt get Vietnam flashbacks all over again. So what happens next? Well, if Trunks wasn't there when Buu was revived, he might stand a chance, because he would sense Buu's power being released and feel how strong he was. However, Trunks would also realize that he's the only hope of stopping Buu, so it's highly possible he would rush in to try and stop him. If so, he would be woefully outmatched and defeated. The only option Trunks has at this point is to escape. As we saw with Gohan and the Supreme Kai, this isn't as easy as it sounds, because Buu isn't just stronger than Trunks, but also faster, so he would easily catch up. But Trunks does have one trick up his sleeve, with that being the Solar Flare technique, a move he used to evade Goku Black during their encounters, so it's entirely possible that he escapes here as well. Now, if Trunks escapes, what comes next? Well, I suspect that Babidi would put out a telepathic all-points bulletin like he did in the main timeline, telling the world that they want to find Trunks and destroy him. Unlike in the main timeline, however, everyone in this world would likely know Trunks as the savior of mankind, the one who killed the androids and Cell. So would they turn him in? Well, I have a feeling that they would probably resist as long as possible. After all, Trunks would be like their version of Mr. Satan, except actually powerful and not a gigantic liar. So their respect and admiration would be helpful here. But even then, they could only buy so much time, because Buu would go from city to city attacking the people and likely turning them into candy. And it's only a matter of time until he shows up in West City and goes after Capsule Corp. Fortunately, time is something that Trunks had in abundance, because after all, Trunks has a time machine. So if Trunks is up against a wall and realizes that he can't win this battle alone, he'll no doubt do what he always does, and go back to the main timeline to get help from everyone there. The only thing that might stop this is the fuel that he would need for the trip. As it was explained in the Cell Saga, the time machine takes a long time to gather enough fuel to make the trip, something which they elaborated on in the Future Trunks arc of Dragon Ball Super. At the end of the Cell arc, we were told that it took 3 years for Trunks to get enough fuel to make the return trip. This was when Imperfect Cell arrived and tried to steal the time machine, just as he did in the original timeline. However, Trunks was ready, and used it as a trap to wipe Cell out. After that, we're given no indication that Trunks ever returned to tell everyone he had succeeded. The only exception is in the BoJack movie, which isn't a part of the main continuity, or even the anime timeline. So it's possible that Trunks never returned to the past, and as a result should have enough fuel for the trip. This would also mean that the scene where Bulma tells Trunks that she finally gathered enough fuel in Dragon Ball Super is a plot hole. Wait a second, a plot hole in Dragon Ball Super? Nah, couldn't be. But let's say for fun that Trunks has enough fuel and wasn't turned into a cookie by Fat Buu the second he showed up. What happens next? Well, Trunks would travel to the past and seek the help of Gohan and Vegeta, since at this point he isn't aware of Goku being alive, and Gohan was the strongest the last time he was there. So if we assume that Trunks arrives at the same place and time that he did in the main timeline, when the Goku Black arc originally took place, he would rush into Capsule Corp and meet with the others who were there at the time, with those being Goku, Vegeta, and Bulma, as well as Beerus and Whis. After finding out that Trunks was from the future, Whis would no doubt give the same speech that he did originally, about the butterfly effect and why time travel is forbidden. So hopefully Trunks would have some of those weird futuristic Slim Jims to appease them. Otherwise, it's Hakai time. At this point, Trunks would explain to those in attendance what was happening in his world. Knowing Vegeta, he would no doubt chastise Trunks for running away and being so weak that he couldn't defeat an enemy that they had earlier. while neglecting to mention that he was beaten by that same enemy twice. Goku would also explain how he came back to life, and some other things that happened since. Then Trunks would likely ask about Gohan, since as I mentioned, he was the strongest at the time when Trunks left. And unlike the super writers in Toriyama, I actually remembered this. It won't just be writing him off, saying that he gave up on martial arts, only to flip-flop and bring him back in the next arc again, even stronger than ever, and randomly able to swap hands with the Super Saiyan Blue. But because we are adhering to what happened at the time, Goku would likely explain that Gohan is taking a break from martial arts to raise his family, which fits in much better than the original explanation. Now, unlike during the conflict with Goku Black, Goku and Vegeta wouldn't need to go to the future to fight with Trunks. Instead, Vegeta would likely suggest to Trunks that they train together, as they briefly did in Super. However, this version of Trunks would be far weaker than the one who arrived in the Goku Black arc, because he hadn't spent a year fighting Black and getting constant Zenkais. So at this point, he wouldn't even be as strong as Vegeta's base form, who is capable of one-shotting Super Saiyan 3 Gotenks in just the previous arc. As a result, I suspect that Vegeta would give him some very harsh training, likely in the Gravity Chamber or the Hyperbolic Time Chamber. Vegeta would take personal investment in his son's world, and train him to be stronger than he ever was before they reunited in Super, perhaps even teaching him about Ki Control and God Ki, showing him forms like Super Saiyan God and Blue, and giving him a goal to strive toward, like he did with Kaba during the Universe 6 tournament. And as we know, Trunks has some insane levels of growth throughout the story. If you don't believe me, just ask Mai. As a result, Trunks would emerge from this training a far more powerful warrior, perhaps even more so than he was when he achieved Super Saiyan Rage. He would then say his goodbyes, return to the future, and face Babidi and Buu once more, easily defeating both of them and obliterating Buu with his overwhelming power. Even Buu's magical regeneration and Candy Beam wouldn't be enough to help him. Nor is it likely that Trunks would allow himself to be absorbed, if Fat Buu can even do that. But everything wouldn't be fine just yet, because after this would come another threat, named Goku Black. However, unlike in the original story, this Trunks would be more than prepared, because despite being in possession of Goku's body, Goku Black would be significantly weaker than Goku was at the time that he took it, because he was still going through the adjustment period of gaining full control over the body, kind of like Captain Ginyu when he swapped bodies with Goku on Namek, which for some reason didn't apply to Tagoma. As a result, the newly trained Trunks would be far more powerful than he was, and likely enough to where Goku Black wouldn't be able to catch up to him with his weird mid-battle Zenkais that he kept getting throughout the arc, at least in the anime version. And Black would get his shit stomped in by Trunks, who would beat him down like Hulk Hogan fighting a jobber in the 1980s, dropping a Super Saiyan leg drop and blasting him right out of his ring into another dimension. It wouldn't be very Subarashi for Goku Black at all. Now, future Zamasu may try to intervene, but all he would do is get beaten down repeatedly until he runs away, likely to go cry about how he could have just wished away future Trunks instead of destroying his only way to win. But I talked about that in another video you can check out here. However, all wouldn't be happy, because Black and Zamasu still swept throughout the multiverse and killed most of the mortals along with the gods. So this ending would be somewhat bittersweet, but it's still better than Trunks having his entire timeline erased by Zeno. And apparently his version of Zeno is usually a lot more chill, since he never even attempted to erase Trunks' universe like he did before the Tournament to Power in the main timeline. Maybe future Daishinkan was a lot better at distracting him. As a result, Trunks would likely live a happier and more peaceful life with his mom and Mai, helping to rebuild society, and maybe this time actually finding out about the Namekian Dragon Balls and repairing more of the damage that was done. And if another enemy were to appear, he would be ready for them. Or at least ready to run back to the main timeline for more help. Because hey, it is Trunks after all. So that was What If Majin Buu is revived in the future Trunks timeline. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Thanks for watching and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. Hey guys, thank you all so much for watching thus far. If you like my content, you can subscribe to this channel and additionally check out my other channel, Laughingstock Cinema, where I talk about live-action TV shows, movies, and so much more down in the description. Thank you all for watching, and let's get into the rest of the video. Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I want to discuss a what-if scenario that I and many others in the Dragon Ball community have wondered about ever since the Buu Saga of Dragon Ball Z. That scenario involves a now iconic fight between Super Vegito and Buuhan, where the fusion of Goku and Vegeta utterly dominated Super Buu with Gohan absorbed. However, a question that many have asked is what would happen if instead of using Potara fusion to become Vegito, Goku and Vegeta used the Metamoran fusion dance and became Gogeta. Exactly how powerful would this theoretical Super Gogeta be, and would he perform as well against Buuhan as Vegito did? Well, in this video, I'm going to discuss that. So the setup for this what-if scenario would be the same as in the original story. After returning to the Earth to help Gohan against Buu-Tanks, Goku intends to fuse with his son. But in this version of the events, we're going to essentially pretend that the movie Fusion Reborn was never created. The reason I say this is because prior to this movie coming out, Toriyama hadn't intended on even creating the Potara fusion. According to this interview with Toriyama, he states that he was originally planning on having Goku and Vegeta use the Metamoran fusion to fight against Buu. However, Toei had just produced the DBZ movie Fusion Reborn shortly before this, which already featured this plot thread as Goku and Vegeta became Gogeta in order to defeat Super Janemba. As a result, Toriyama felt the need to create another form of fusion, which became Potara fusion, the supposedly permanent fusion of the Supreme Kais, and from that, Vegito was born. However, Fusion Reborn never happened, and instead we got something else, like Broly 4 Back for More, where this time he's a robot. Toriyama would have gone with his original intended plan of dance fusion. So in this alternate reality where Goku and Gohan are planning to fuse, Buu would absorb Goku's son and steal his wardrobe for himself. Although to be fair, he stole it from Master Roshi first. This is when Vegeta appeared with fortune teller Baba, returning from the afterlife to help fight Buu, and when Goku would teleport to his dead rival in order to fuse with him. However, this is where we would encounter an issue, because Vegeta in this scenario has never fused before or practiced the moves himself, and precise movements and synchronization are essential for the fusion to work here, something which would take time that quickly was ticking down. On top of that, Vegeta would still be upset with Goku for holding back Super Saiyan 3 during their fight, and as a result they would probably still be arguing by the time that Buuhan caught up to them. Now in the original story, Buuhan wasn't interested in waiting around to let the two of them fuse to fight him. Once he heard about their plan, he attempted to intervene. However, by the time that they snapped on their earrings, it was far too late, as he received a major one-sided beatdown. But here, things would be different, and I'm doubtful that he would be willing to give Goku and Vegeta another time out just so that they could combine and give him a challenge. And unlike in Fusion Reborn or more recently Dragon Ball Super Broly, there's no one left who can distract him while they perfect the technique, so this could potentially bring about an early end to our scenario. However, Goku does have a trick up his sleeve that would change things, with that being instant transmission. So if he realized that there's nothing they can do to stop Buu at the time, Goku would quickly teleport them away somewhere else to give them that time that they need. The best and most likely location that he would go to is where King Kai is located, because it's in a separate dimension that Buu can't reach, and also it's kind of Goku's go-to place whenever shit gets real. He could also potentially teleport to the sacred realm of the Kais. After all, he teleported from there to the Earth. Or perhaps upon seeing Gohan get absorbed, Supreme Kai will intervene earlier this time and bring the Saiyans to his world, preferably before Buu tries to blow up the planet. At this point, Goku and Vegeta would be able to train to learn the move just like they did in Fusion Reborn, likely messing up a couple times along the way, since that seems to be a running gag with first-time fusions. And then finally becoming Gogeta before they go back to fight Buu. However, the question is, what will be happening during that time? After all, Buuhan is still on Earth, and there's no one able to fight him. Ten Shinhan is knocked out, and the rest are either dead or absorbed. The only one who might be able to be a threat to Buu at this point would be Android 17 if we use Dragon Ball Super's continuity. But he's too busy fighting space poachers to care. So the only ones left to fight Buu would be Mr. Satan and Dende, which basically means that the world is doomed. However, there is a small sliver of hope with Mr. Satan, because he and Fat Buu were friends before Evil Buu absorbed him. This held Super Buu back from killing the world champ on multiple occasions, such as when he first transformed, and then when he used the human extinction attack. Even when Fat Buu was disconnected inside of Kid Buu, his influence was still enough to stop him from killing Hercule. So maybe there's a chance it would happen here too. With that being said, it didn't seem to be stopping Buu when he was right about to blow up the planet before Goku arrived, or when he thought that he had absorbed Vegito. So perhaps it would only be a brief distraction. So there's a strong possibility that this would lead to the Earth being destroyed, and their battle taking place elsewhere. However, because Buu would have the intelligence and knowledge of both Gohan and Piccolo, he would likely realize that Goku and Vegeta simply wouldn't leave the Earth to its fate, and instead would return to fight him. So much like he did with Gohan, where he waited for him to come to the Earth for their fight, I could see Buuhan taking a short break here too. Unlike with Gotenks, he wouldn't have to worry about his fusion timer running out, so as a result, he likely wouldn't see any threat in waiting. Although I could see him killing Dende for shits and giggles. Sorry, Little Green. This leads to the fight between Gogeta and Buuhan and the question of how powerful Gogeta would be compared to Vegito, because this plays a massive role in how the fight turns out. Now the question of which fusion is stronger is one that fans have wondered forever, because despite having the same fusion components, the method of fusion creates a totally different person with their own appearance and personality, as well as power and techniques. Of course, the power of this fusion depends on the strength of Goku and Vegeta at the time and which arc. Obviously, Gogeta arcs later would be more powerful than Vegeta arcs sooner, and vice versa. But the question here is if Goku and Vegeta had the exact same starting scenario for both fusions, which would be stronger and who would perform better against Buu? Now, despite it being just about impossible for these two to ever fight, this question has been answered a number of times over the years in extra materials, such as guides. And in typical Dragon Ball fashion, the answer is always contradictory. One guide says that Vegito is stronger and Potara fusion is more powerful than Dance fusion, but naturally there's also stuff that says Gogeta is more powerful, or that it would depend on the length of the battle. And now, the most recent story as of this video is that they're equal, which I'm sure tons of people have already commented down below long before I reached this point, as if this time it's the most canonist answer of all. But honestly, I'm more interested in the original intention and continuity of when this was written, before Super or the current preconceptions were in Toriyama and Toei's mind, and before they wanted to make Gogeta seem on an even level to promote the Broly movie. Because let's be honest, the answer really comes down to what they're trying to sell at the time. But within the Buu Saga itself, we're told something different. It's specifically stated by Elder Supreme Kai that this form of fusion is superior to the one used by Goten and Trunks, but what exactly that means is up for debate. Now, it could simply be superior because it's permanent, which is also mentioned during the same conversation. Additionally, this form of fusion can happen regardless of power levels or species of those fusing. A Super Saiyan 3 confused with a base form Saiyan, and Farmer with a shotgun confused with Frieza. We even get some wacky examples of this as imagined by Goku. And this happened in the manga, so Dendoku and Goku Satan are clearly canon. But the final answer could be that there was in fact a difference in the multiplier of the fusions, and Potara could just be stronger. It does make sense when you think about it, because after all, unlike finger fusion, the components don't need to suppress their powers, and the final power level likely isn't based on that limited strength. But conversely, just because Goku and Vegeta need to match their powers, doesn't mean that the final fusion is weaker. It isn't like that energy isn't still within their bodies just because they're suppressed. That's not how Ki works. Either way, even if there is a difference in power, I don't think it would be that significant. And even if it is, I don't think it would matter here. And that's because whatever fusion of Goku and Vegeta we get should be far more powerful than Buuhan, just based upon what we saw in the Buu Saga. After all, look at Gotenks, the fusion of Goten and Trunks, who are individually weaker than Goku, Vegeta, and Gohan. And yet when they combined were capable of becoming a Super Saiyan 3. They weren't even that far below Ultimate Gohan and were stronger than Super Buu. And then when Buu absorbed them, they were capable of defeating Ultimate Gohan. And based upon statements like this, we know that Buu's absorption is addition rather than multiplication. So that means that Buu with Gohan and the others absorbed likely wasn't even 3 times stronger than he was before based upon the previous fights. But I go far more in depth into that subject in this video you can see here. Also worth adding is a statement from Super Buu when he's charging in to attack the newly forming Vegito, when he says that this theoretical fusion wouldn't be a match for him. Of course, Buu had absorbed Goten Trunks into his body, so he should realistically understand this fusion multiplier. But with that being said, I always saw this more as bluster from him rather than an actual accurate statement. A typical line from a Dragon Ball villain right before a stronger hero dominates them, which is exactly what happens with Vegito. And then there's also this statement from Goku when he's inside of Buu's brain with Vegeta, where he says that they aren't a match for base Super Buu individually, but can win if they fuse again with the dance, which naturally Vegeta refuses to do. So if they can beat base Super Buu as Gogeta, it stands to reason that they can beat a version of him that's maybe a few times stronger. Now, based upon every single appearance of a fusion in the Dragon Ball story, we're shown that their base form is likely more powerful than the most powerful form of the individual Saiyans. We saw this in the anime when base Vegito dominated Buu. Then we saw in the Dragon Ball Super manga when base Vegito blasted off Merge Zamasu's arm and was mistaken for some kind of new form. And then finally when base Gogeta took on Broly. Now in the manga version, Vegito went Super Saiyan right away to fight Buuhan, but that still fits in with this theme, because Buuhan was far above both Goku and Vegeta individually. So theoretically, if Gogeta appears on the battlefield and has a base form on the level of Super Saiyan 3 Goku, and then he goes Super Saiyan on top of that, he's going to stomp Buu just like Vegito did. And even if there is a strength disparity, he can just go Super Saiyan 2 and 3 on top of that. However, as we saw with Gotenks, Super Saiyan 3 has a drawback with a fusion that it drops their timer from 30 minutes down to 5, due to its incredible power consumption. But even still, I doubt they would need it, or that the fight would even last that long. Now with Gogeta firmly in control of Buu here, what happens next? Well, in the original story, we saw that Vegito came up with a plan to go inside of Buu and save their friends who had been absorbed, which led to them defusing and eventually Kid Buu appearing before destroying the Earth and beginning the final fight of the arc. However, in this case, I think that things would be different, because unlike with Vegito, Goku and Vegeta aren't under the belief that their fusion is permanent. So with Gogeta aware that his fusion timer is only 30 minutes, will he come up with the same plan that he did originally? After all, he has no idea how long it'll take to save his family, or even if this plan would work. But with the clock ticking down from the moment that they correctly hit the fusion, I have a feeling the answer will be no. Because even despite the ticking clock, Goku and Vegeta should know that they don't even need to separate their families from Buu to begin with. After all, we saw in the Cell Saga that Android 17 was able to be wished back from the dead after Cell was killed, despite being combined with him at the time of their death. So the same rule should apply here. Thus, I suspect that Gogeta would resign himself to killing Buu. However, there is a chance that their families could survive this battle if Gogeta uses his signature technique, the Stardust Breaker. Because for those of you who might be unaware, Gogeta used this attack to totally destroy the evil within Janemba, applying a similar idea as the Spirit Bomb, which targeted Buu's evil ki and obliterated him. When Gogeta did this, the child ogre that Janemba was using as a host was left fully intact. So perhaps if he uses this attack on Buuhan, the being known as Buu will cease to exist, and those he absorbed will be just fine, which would make for a nice conclusion. However, even if they are forced to kill Buu and this doesn't work, they can simply use the new Namekian Dragon Balls to wish them back free of Buu. I suspect that Vegeta and the other victims killed by Buu would be returned at this point as well. On the other side of the coin, if things played out the same way as they did in the original story, with Gogeta allowing himself to be absorbed, the ending would likely play out the exact same way as it did originally, because Buu would remain alive after this fight, become Kid Buu, and so on. In the scenario where Gogeta wins with the Stardust Breaker, I could also see good Buu remaining alive, because when he split earlier on in the arc, he separated himself from his evil, like Kami did with King Piccolo, so the good Buu should remain, whereas Kid Buu wouldn't. Now perhaps around this time we would see Goku lament the fact that he couldn't win on his own, and ask King Yema for Buu to return as a better person, leading eventually to the end of Z, where the tournament with Oob happens and Goku flies off with him into the distance. Now aside from the arc ending earlier and the Earth not being destroyed, things would remain relatively the same after this point. However, one difference would be that Vegeta never admitted that Goku was number 1. However, Vegeta would still be aware that Goku is stronger due to possessing Super Saiyan 3, and their rivalry would continue into Dragon Ball Super. Another difference would be that the Earth didn't help Goku to defeat Buu, but considering that they wiped their memories 6 months later anyway, it doesn't really make a difference. So all in all, things would be pretty much the same. So this has been What If Gogeta Replaced Vegito in the Buu Saga. Overall, I think that things would have gone relatively the same, with the fusion dominating Buu. However, with Gogeta's special technique, the Stardust Breaker, we could have seen an outcome with far less destruction. The fight itself would have been an awesome one to behold, perhaps even better than what we got in the original story. But in the current timeline that we live in, chances are that this will be yet another what-if fight that will remain exclusively within our imaginations. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. What if the World's Martial Arts Tournament in the Buu Saga was never interrupted? How would the tournament play out, and who would be declared the winner? Well, let's get into that now. So fortunately for this what-if scenario, a lot of the speculation has already been filled in by Toriyama, as the bracket for this tournament was introduced just before the action began, as you can see here. This tournament was originally planned to have 4 rounds, with 15 matches in total. Out of the 8 matches in the first round, only 3 of them played out to their natural conclusions. Those fights were Krillin versus Pinta, and Krillin won this match with ease because he was up against a human who couldn't use ki. Despite their size difference, Krillin is a planet buster, so this was a walk in the park for him. Next was Piccolo versus Shin, which Piccolo forfeited before the match could begin. Now, according to what Piccolo says next, it's possible that he conceded because Shin was of a different dimension or higher order than him. Although the translation I have here says one thing, the expression that he says here is often used in Dragon Ball to say that someone is more powerful than you. Like this moment from the Cell Saga where Tien senses Goku transform into a Super Saiyan. However, Shin was the highest god at the time, which Piccolo recognized because Kami was the god of the earth at one point. Although he mistakenly thought that Shin was the Grand Kai rather than Supreme Kai. So there's an argument to be made that Piccolo only quit because of that. However, I honestly think it's
a little from column A, a little from column B.
Though it's a shame that Piccolo's power was made so irrelevant in this arc. Next up was Videl vs Popovich, which was one of the most brutal one-side beatdowns in the series, especially in the anime, which drags it out even longer. At first, Videl was winning, but once Popovich decided to try, he easily defeated her. But that didn't stop him from brutalizing her until Yamu said to drop her out of the ring, which he finally relented. Now that leaves the remaining fights that would have happened, beginning with the fight that was interrupted and threw the whole tournament into disarray. Gohan versus Kibito. I think it's pretty clear that Gohan would win with ease. Now sure, Kibito was first presented as being tough, but once Gohan went Super Saiyan 2 for him, it was obvious just how outclassed he really was. And I doubt that Gohan would even need to go 2 here. But while he was at it, he might as well go for the overkill. That's what I always do. Originally, Popovich and Yamu jumped in to sap his strength here, but let's just say in this scenario that they observed that this was happening, but then realized that they stood no chance in hell against Gohan, and decided that they'd wait until the end of the tournament, when he was weakened, to steal his power. Which obviously would have made a lot more sense than what happened in the Buu Saga, considering the fact that they could tell just how incredibly powerful Gohan was, and yet for some reason they still thought they could jump in and stop him. Almost as if they read the script and knew that Supreme Kai would be there to stop them. Either way, Gohan stomps Kibito here and moves on to the next fight against Popovich. Then we would come to an interesting matchup, with that being Android 18 versus Mr. Satan. Now this match sort of happened in the original story when the two were pitted against each other in the Battle Royal. During that matchup, Android 18 easily had the advantage. However, she gave Mr. Satan an ultimatum to pay 20 million zeni in exchange for her throwing the fight, which she did in humorous fashion, complete with a fake delayed reaction punch, like something out of Fist of North Star. NANI? However, in this case, the entire situation is very different. There is no battle royal, simply a one-on-one fight in an earlier round. And as a result, 18 knows that Mr. Satan is doomed to lose even if she throws the fight here, because he would go on to face Goku or Vegeta. As a result, I think that 18 would quickly defeat Mr. Satan here, which would come to the shock of many of the fans and the audiences watching the tournament, as well as guaranteeing that there would be a new champion to be crowned, as if we didn't already know that. Furthermore, Mr. Satan's popularity would likely decline from this bout, and he may even learn some humility. Well, unless he spins it to the audience that he threw the fight, like saying that he did it for the benefit of the tournament, and he just wanted to see who else was worthy of becoming the champion. I wouldn't put it past him, he certainly spun his way out of worse situations in the past. Next up is what many would consider the main event, which is ironically in the first round. Goku versus Vegeta. And honestly, despite it sounding like a cool fight, the winner here is already pretty much locked. blocked, because as it was explained by Vegeta himself, Goku's powers as Super Saiyan 2 was greater than that of Vegeta's, which led to him becoming Majin Vegeta so that he could stand a chance of winning. As a result, Goku would outmatch Vegeta during their fight in every form: Base, Super Saiyan, and Super Saiyan 2. Now, some people think that Vegeta wasn't even a Super Saiyan 2 here, but that's incorrect. He heavily implies that he achieved it before even becoming Majin, such as when he was looking down on Gohan's power in that form, or the statement right here when he witnessed Goku use it against Yakan and declared that Goku had done it too, or even the statement here where he thinks he might have been able to beat Gohan. With that being said, I don't think that Goku would just stomp Vegeta and would likely expend a good amount of energy during their fight, especially if they both transform. Now, originally they went to this fight with no intention to use the Super Saiyan form, because of the promise to Gohan, since he was still trying to hide that from Videl. But with Goten and Trunks ignoring that and then Gohan doing it against Kibito, I doubt that they would hold back either. Although obviously Goku wouldn't use Super Saiyan 3. Either way, he moves on to the next round. Up next would be Goten and Trunks disguised as Mighty Mass taking on Killa, which would end even faster than I can finish this sentence, with the Super Saiyan kids going on to the next round. The same can be said for the final fight of round 1, Yamu versus Jewel, which Yamu would easily win with his use of Babdi's dark magic, which was bestowed upon him with the Majin mark. Perhaps he would pull a Spopovich and torment Jewel first, turning the so-called pretty boy into a mangled mess. But considering how he stepped in to stop the match between Spopovich and Videl, he seems very no-nonsense and would likely end it fast. This leads into the next round of the tournament, where we would see some interesting matchups, beginning with Krillin versus Shin. Now, despite Krillin being declared the strongest human by Yamcha earlier, which I'm sure that Tien would disagree with, and yes, Tien is still human even if he supposedly descended from an alien tribe, just as much as Gohan, Trunks, and the other halflings are also human, I think it's a foregone conclusion that Krillin loses here with ease. Supreme Kai could one-shot Frieza at 100%, so Krillin doesn't stand any chance, although perhaps he may try and gain the advantage by using the Solar Flare in multiform. But all Shin has to do is finger flick him out of the ring, and he moves on to the next round. Next is a fight that pretty much everyone wanted to see, but we never got a chance to, which is Gohan versus Spopovich, and I think here that Gohan would stomp him with a vengeance. This is the guy who brutalized Videl, the girl Gohan was in love with, and nearly pushed him to throw everything away and charging in to stop it. I think that Gohan will return everything to him in kind, by beating him so badly that even the dark magic won't allow him to get back up, all before spiking him out of the ring like a football in the end zone, complete with Spopovich's own Yamcha pose. Now that would have been a feel-good moment. Next up is Goku versus Android 18, and despite Android 18 being much stronger than base Goku here, he would easily defeat her upon becoming a Super Saiyan. After all, Goku surpassed Android 18 7 years before when he was trained with Gohan in the Time Chamber, so unless Goku messed around and doesn't use that form quickly enough, this would be an easier win for him than his fight against Vegeta. The only factor that might make this somewhat harder is if Goku is tired from facing Vegeta, kinda like what happened when he was fighting the Cell Juniors. But even then it would still end with him as the obvious winner. And then we get to the fight between Goten, Trunks versus Yamu, which they would also win with ease, likely even without transforming. After all, Yamu was one-shot by Pui Pui, who is weaker than base Vegeta, so ironically the guy who looks like Stone Cold Steve Austin is getting a mudhole stomped on him instead. This leads to the semi-finals, where there are two more interesting matchups. First between Gohan and Supreme Kai. Now based upon the power of these two fighters, I think that Gohan would win here. However, I don't believe that would be as one-sided of a fight as many people think. Shin's power, for example, is much higher than most people give it credit for, as not only did he specifically state that he could defeat Frieza with one blow, but we saw him restrain Super Saiyan 2 Gohan during the tournament. Then when comparing their respective fights, Shin put up what seemed like an even better fight against Fat Buu than Gohan did. So there's a chance here that he could take an upset victory, like if he froze Gohan and then knocked him out of the ring. Or maybe perhaps tying into the plot if he explained who he was mid-fight and asked Gohan to throw their match. Although I doubt that Gohan would do that. However, Gohan's overall power is still greater than Shin's, being able to fight against Deborah, who was said to be even stronger than Cell by Goku, the same Deborah that Shin was afraid of. So I'd say that Gohan wins here after becoming a Super Saiyan 2. Then we get our first father-son matchup of the tournament as Goku faces Goten and Trunks, albeit in disguise. During this fight, the three would likely begin their base these forms. However, as Goku's power proves too great for them, I'm sure that Goten and Trunks would transform, which would lead to Goku doing so as well. Now, despite being portrayed as pretty slow, especially in the Buu Saga onward, I think that Goku would likely figure out who he's fighting as the match goes on, just like Android 18 did. Goku also watched and sensed the fight between Goten and Trunks before, so if he senses them again right in front of him and sees that this guy is glowing with a yellow aura, I'm guessing that he would probably figure out who he's fighting. So I'm sure this match would come to an end with Goku destroying their disguise and the so-called Mighty Mask being disqualified. However, this would provide for a nice moment in which Goku could spar with his son, no doubt commending him for his incredible power for his age and allowing Goten to walk away with a greater appreciation for his father. Oh, and I'm sure that Trunks would like him more too. Although maybe Vegito would be butthurt that his son lost to Kakarot too. And this leads to the final match of the tournament, which is also the most appropriate given the arc that we'd seen leading up to this point, with that being Gohan versus Goku. And here we would get a fight between father and son which we had never properly saw in the Dragon Ball story until Dragon Ball Super, with the current main character Gohan facing the prior one Goku in his last hurrah on Earth. And if we're looking at this match entirely based on their power levels, Goku would take the victory here. Not only would Goku be more powerful in each of his forms, but he would also have far greater experience between the two, and Gohan lost most of his fighting sense over the course of the last 7 years. So as the fight played out between them, Goku's strength advantage would become more and more apparent. However, there are a couple of ways that Gohan could possibly get the upset win, with the first being due to stamina. After all, Goku would have more difficult fights along the way than Gohan did, having to face Vegeta, Android 18, and 2 Super Saiyans at once. So if his stamina is lower than Gohan's, I could see that making the fight closer. But considering that Goku got Senzu Beans earlier on in the tournament, there's a chance that this would be rendered completely irrelevant. The other way would be if Goku used this match to train Gohan, rather than approaching it as a serious fight, akin to the fight between the two in Dragon Ball Super, where Goku pushes Gohan to bring out more of his hidden potential and is eventually overwhelmed by it, at least in the forms that we had already seen. Now later on in the original story, when the Saiyans were on Babidi's ship, we saw Vegeta make the statement that if Gohan raged out, he could stand a chance against Goku and Vegeta. So it could be that Goku basically engineers his own defeat, and through Gohan's current plot armor as the main character and also his hormones raging to show Videl how strong he is, maybe he can sneak out a win. However, I think that ultimately Goku would be declared the winner, as his strength, experience, and if he needs it, his Super Saiyan 3 form, would be enough to win him his second title as World's Martial Arts Champion. Now, as for what happens after the tournament, this is when I suspect that Spopovich and Yamu would intervene. However, instead of stealing Gohan's energy, they would take the weakened Goku's. With that being said, if this plays out similarly to how the main story did with Supreme Kai restraining Goku instead of Gohan, then they would fly off to Babidi's ship and the Z fighters would be right behind them. However, this time, I don't think that Majin Buu would be revived. Instead, the Z fighters would likely defeat Babidi, Deborah, and the others before they can achieve their goal. That's because of one major difference, with that being that Goku and Vegeta already had their fight, with Vegeta losing. So as a result, Vegeta would have no incentive to become Majin, especially if Goku used Super Saiyan 3 before that, because he would know just how outmatched he is. As a result, the Super Saiyan 2s would stomp Deborah, wipe out Babidi, and eliminate the threat before it ever comes to be, at which point Supreme Kai would hopefully move the ball somewhere else, or attempt to destroy it without waking Buu. And without the old Kai being released from the Z-Sword and then giving Goku his life, Goku would return to heaven, leaving the future of the Earth in the hands of the next generation. Hopefully they won't screw everything up this time. As far as whatever happens next, I leave that up to you. Choose your own adventure, and have fun. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I want to talk about a subject that I've wondered, and I know a lot of other fans have wondered, ever since the Buu Saga of Dragon Ball Z. And that would have to be something revolving around Fat Majin Buu. More specifically, what were to happen if the Supreme Kais that are currently inside of Buu were to be removed, with that being the Daikaioshin and possibly the Southern Supreme Kai, as I mentioned in a video that you could see down below in the description and on my channel about what happened to the Southern Supreme Kai. But what exactly would happen to Buu if you took these other Kais out of him? Well, let me get into the manga and talk a little bit about what exactly happened with Buu and those Kais being inside of him, and then we'll get into that discussion. So for recap, as we know, during the Buu Saga, when Goku and Vegeta had fused into Vegito and were dominating Super Buuhan, they decided on a plan in which they would go inside of Buu's body, as you could see here, and then go about releasing all of their friends who were inside of pods inside of his body. However, one thing they didn't account for is that they had found Fat Buu inside of him as well. And this must have happened after the skinny Buu, Gray Buu, or whatever you want to call him, decided to turn this Fat Buu into chocolate. Instead of just eating and digesting him like he did the others, wiping them out in the process, he did in fact incorporate Buu in a pod in his body, which allowed him to transform into Super Buu, taking all the power, the essence, and everything that's in Fat Buu without really any of the weaknesses and harnessing that to its maximum potential, which I also talked about in another video. Wow, I reference a lot of videos in these. But nonetheless, what ended up happening? Well, as we would see in time, Vegeta would go and proceed to take this Buu, Fat Buu, out of Super Buu. And this is what led to Buu reverting back into, let's go to see what happens, his previous stages of the absorptions that he had. For example, he regressed back through the stage in which Kid Buu had absorbed the Southern Supreme Kai. And that's why he became larger, his body became more muscular, and as Goku said, he looked like he was taking roids. And at this point, he continued to regress because he no longer had the impact or anything with regard to Fat Buu and the Kais inside of him playing a part on his body, until, of course, he went back to the purest form of all, the original Buu of Kid Buu, pure Buu, the pure evil Aku Buu that we see right here. And this is the point where Supreme Kai explains that there used to be a number of other Lord of Lords, for the other four that is, the Grand Supreme Kai, the Dai Kaioshin, the Kaioshin and others, but of course, Buu had killed two of them, and then he went on to absorb the Southern Supreme Kai, and eventually the Fat Supreme Kai. And as you can see right here, this Dai Kaioshin, the Great Lord of Lords, as they call him in the manga, is the one that looks the most like Fat Buu, because the fact that when Buu absorbed him, as you can see over here on the left, it tamed him, it changed him significantly on a fundamental level because of the good-hearted nature and the gentle spirit of the Fat Buu, of the Fat Kai rather, which created Fat Buu, which had the full control over Buu, and additionally, not just that, but it also limited his power and the malice that he could put out comparative to when he was Super Buu, and especially Kid Buu, who isn't really limited by any of these things. So as we know, when you remove Fat Buu and the other influences from Buu, you get Kid Buu, the true original one, before he has any of the other things stacked on top of him. Kind of like how Frieza regresses from his form that we initially see him in back to his base form, with those transformations serving to limit him. In a similar way, so too does that happen with Super Buu, Fat Buu, and so on, other than Kid Buu. The only thing I would say is that with regard to Super Buu is that when Evil Buu, the Wrath Buu, Gray Buu, took over him, he was able to suppress the influence of this Kai so that he no longer was limited in terms of his power, which is why, many people have said over the years, and there's definitely a great argument to say, this one isn't as powerful, but he definitely is more dangerous, as they say here, the most difficult one, because of his lack of remorse, because of the fact that all he cares about is destruction, having fun, doing things like that, and basically seems to have infinite stamina, among other things. And there's no real influence or impact that we see on Kid Buu, with the exception of later on when he goes to fight against Mr. Satan. When Mr. Satan comes on to fight him, and what happens? Well, Kid Buu is holding back against what, he actually wants to do, against his own wishes, because Fat Buu is still inside of him, having a very slight impact on what he could do, specifically in terms of Mr. Satan. Until, of course, Kid Buu, finds out how to channel him into his mouth, I guess you could say, and spits him out like a piece of gum and separates him. So at this point, we know that Fat Buu and Kid Buu are not the same Buu. They are not the same being. They are completely separate, So even when Kid Buu is eventually wiped out, Fat Buu still remains. So the question becomes, what exactly happens to cause not only the separation, but also what would happen if there was an additional separation with these Buus? Well, I think that what might have happened is that over the millions of years that Buu was sealed away inside of his shell and basically became pure energy, pure smoke, whatever he was in there, that is what caused the full true merging and combination of the other Kais within him. The Grand Supreme Kai, or Daikaio Shin, the Southern Supreme Kai, merging within him in a sense to where he became this separate being. So it is possible that at this point, even though we do go on later to see the Grand Supreme Kai taking over the body through the consciousness that becomes Fat Buu, the question is at that point, are they really separate anymore? Or is this one being now, and it really is the Daikaio Shin, maybe Supreme Kai from the South, just with Buu's DNA and with like new memories and possibly a new soul? A question in of that self right there. And if that is the case, or maybe even isn't the case, what would happen if they were to actually be removed from him? Would they go back to being these Kais right here? As in, let's say that Vegeta in Dragon Ball Super were to use his Force Spirit Fission ability that he learned in the Moro arc, in which he was able to separate someone who is fused together. You know, he could possibly separate Potara fusion. They even referenced that he could separate the biological fusion of Kami and Piccolo, and possibly even Nail, I'm assuming so as well. So at that point, if he could remove them from one another and separate them back into their individual forms, certainly he'd be able to do so here. Same thing would have to be the case possibly with the Dragon Balls. Like if Buu said, okay, I'll let you use the Dragon Balls on me to separate me, maybe it would negate his power difference between him and the God of the Earth and the Guardian, and then in turn be able to do that. Or they could use the Super Dragon Balls, which would, you know, make it irrelevant because the fact that the Super Dragon Balls seemingly can grant literally any wish, even undoing what Zeno, the highest god that we know at the time, was capable of doing. So if that were to happen, would Fat Buu cease to exist? Would he no longer be Buu at all? Or, you know, would this, as we see right here, Kid Buu, a different version of him maybe, exist instead? Maybe Kid Buu basically duplicated, but when all of this occurred. However, the fact of the matter is that he wouldn't be the truly malevolent evil Buu that we had seen before. He would rather be, you know, a version of Kid Buu that was nicer, that was friendlier, that had the personality of Fat Buu inside of him. You know, and at the same time, too, if that is the case, what happens with Oob? You know, we saw in Dragon Ball GT, for example, that Fat Buu and Oob merged together to reunite once and for all to become Majoob or Super Oob or whatever you'd like to call them, depending upon the different version or translation. So is it possible that there actually could be more than one iteration of Buu simultaneously with a Kid Buu? That would be the new version of Buu and Oob. I mean, wow, Buu is so complicated. I feel like I need a degree in quantum mechanics just to completely understand everything about this guy. But nonetheless, what would happen? Well, I think that really comes down to whether or not Buu is truly separate from these Kais now. Would Buu be a separate being and these two would be separate beings, or perhaps because they did fully merge together, they are no longer able to actually be separate beings. They're only one being now, which is Fat Buu. And then, of course, you can't truly separate him. That's a question I'd love to hear. You guys speculate on down below in the comments and let me know, because it is one of the biggest what ifs, I suppose, in the Dragon Ball franchise. Now, of course, as is the case with a lot of the different things that we see in Dragon Ball Super and the modern Dragon Ball, until they go past this end of Z, where we could see right here that takes place 10 years after the events of the Buu Saga, where everything takes place after Dragon Ball Super, nothing really is probably going to happen with Buu in that regard, because the fact that we still see him right here as Mr. Buu. He is alongside Mr. Satan, constantly helping him to be able to stay the champion, because Buu gets to the finals and then throws the fight every single time, so Mr. Satan can keep his power. Talk about being a great friend for Buu there. And on top of that, you know, if this does tend to happen, or somehow does happen before the true end of Z, then we would have to assume that either they go back to being Fat Buu once again, or perhaps instead they end up, not changing his full identity whatsoever. So that's just something to keep in mind. But alright guys, what do you think? Do you think that if Fat Buu were to have the Kais removed from him right now, after the Buu Saga, that he would cease to exist, that he'd become another Kid Buu, or something entirely different might happen altogether? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. Also, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future. Thanks for watching. Hey guys, thank you all so much for watching this video. You all are awesome. If you're interested, I also broke down the biggest and greatest what-if scenarios from the Cell Saga, which you can see in the top right corner and down below in the description. Also, make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and enable those notifications to stay up to date with all my future videos, and stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.